Welcome to a journey through the messy, fascinating history of political parties in the United States. We're looking at a timeline that stretches from the birth of the nation to the late 19th century, showing how parties started, split, and reinvented themselves over time. In 1789, George Washington became the first president, and back then, the idea of political parties wasn't really a thing. Washington actually warned against them in his farewell address, saying they'd tear the country apart. But even during his presidency, two camps started to form over some pretty big disagreements. On one side, you had the Federalists, founded around 1791 by Alexander Hamilton, with John Adams as a key figure. These guys wanted a strong federal government. They pushed for a national bank, protective tariffs to boost industry, and a tight relationship with Britain. They were mostly supported by merchants, bankers, and folks in the Northeast who wanted a more centralized, industrial-focused America. On the other side were the Democratic-Republicans, officially formed in 1792 by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They saw the Federalists as too elitist and cozy with the British. The Democratic-Republicans were all about states' rights, keeping the federal government small and supporting farmers over industrialists. They also leaned toward France, especially during the French Revolution, which the Federalists hated. These two groups weren't just debating policy, they had fundamentally different visions for the country. By the election of 1800, things came to a head. Jefferson beat Adams in a nasty campaign, and the Federalists started to fade fast. Their party pretty much collapsed after 1816, when they couldn't even field a serious candidate against James Monroe. With the Federalists out of the picture, the Democratic-Republicans basically ran the show through the early 1800s. This period, especially under Monroe's presidency from 1817 to 1825, is often called the era of good feelings because there was no real opposition party. But don't let the name fool you, there was plenty of tension brewing. The Democratic-Republicans weren't as unified as they seemed. Some, like John Quincy Adams, leaned toward Federalist ideas like infrastructure projects and a stronger government. Others stuck to Jefferson's small government, agrarian roots. By the 1824 election, these cracks started to show. That election was a mess. Four candidates, all calling themselves Democratic Republicans, ran against each other. Andrew Jackson won the popular vote but lost in a backroom deal to Adams, which Jackson's supporters called a corrupt bargain. That election in 1824 was the breaking point for the Democratic Republicans. Jackson, furious over his loss, started rallying his supporters, mostly farmers, workers, and frontier folks. By 1828, his faction officially became the Democratic Party. The Democrats were all about the common man. They wanted low tariffs, westward expansion, and a hands-off federal government. But they also fiercely supported slavery, especially in the South, where their base was strongest. Meanwhile, the other wing of the old Democratic Republicans, led by John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, formed the National Republican Party around 1824. They were more about building up the country. Think roads, canals, and a national bank to fuel industry. They also wanted higher tariffs to protect American businesses. The National Republicans didn't last long, though. By 1833, they merged with other anti-Jackson groups, like former Federalists and some disgruntled Democrats, to form the Whig Party. The Whigs were a big tent, united mostly by their hatred of Jackson's policies. They supported Clay's American system, which meant federal investment in infrastructure, a national bank, and protective tariffs. Their base was a mix of northern industrialists, some southern planters, and people who just didn't like Jackson's style of populism. The Whigs and Democrats went head-to-head through the 1830s and 1840s, creating what historians call the Second Party System. It was a fierce rivalry. Democrats like James K. Polk pushed expansion, like the annexation of Texas in 1845, while Whigs like William Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor tried to hold the line on economic modernization. But the Whigs couldn't hold it together. The big issue that broke them was slavery. By the late 1840s and early 1850s, the debate over whether slavery should spread to new territories, like those gained from the Mexican-American War, was tearing the country apart. The Whigs had northern members who were anti-slavery and southern members who were pro-slavery, and they couldn't reconcile the two. The Compromise of 1850, which tried to balance slave and free states, only delayed the inevitable. Then came the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which let new territories decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. That decision caused chaos. Violence broke out in Kansas, and the Whigs just couldn't take a unified stand. By 1856, the party was done, splitting into factions that either joined the Democrats or looked for a new home. Out of the Whigs' collapse, a new party emerged, the Republicans. The Republican Party was officially founded in 1854 in Ripon, Wisconsin, by a mix of anti-slavery activists, including former Whigs, Free Soilers, who opposed slavery's expansion, and even some Northern Democrats. Their core issue was stopping the spread of slavery into the Western territories. They weren't abolitionists at first. They didn't call for ending slavery where it already existed, but they were firm on keeping it out of new lands. Economically, they were more like the Whigs, supporting railroads, tariffs, and free land for settlers through the Homestead Act. Their first big moment came in 1860, when Abraham Lincoln won the presidency on a platform of free soil, free labor, free men. That election was a tipping point. Southern states seceded, the Civil War broke out, and the Republicans became the party of the Union. The Civil War reshaped the political landscape. The Republicans dominated during and after the war, especially under Lincoln and then Ulysses S. Grant, who took office in 1869. They pushed big changes: the abolition of slavery with the 13th Amendment, Reconstruction to rebuild the South, and economic policies that fueled industrialization, like railroads and protective tariffs. Their base was in the North, with strong support from business interests, freed black voters, and Union veterans. But they weren't perfect. Corruption scandals like the Credit Mobilier affair in the 1870s started to hurt their reputation, and Reconstruction became a lightning rod. Many white Southerners hated Republican policies that empowered black citizens, and by the late 1870s, Reconstruction ended as Republicans pulled federal troops out of the South. While the Republicans held power, the Democrats didn't disappear, they just shifted. After the Civil War, they became the Party of the South, where white voters used them to resist Reconstruction and enforce segregation through Jim Crow laws. They also picked up support in northern cities, especially among immigrant workers who didn't trust Republican economic policies. The Democrats stuck to their roots of limited government, low tariffs, and states' rights, but they were also the party of white supremacy at the time. By the 1880s, they started making a comeback. Grover Cleveland, a Democrat, won the presidency in 1884 and again in 1892, breaking the Republican streak. Cleveland appealed to farmers and workers by opposing high tariffs and government overreach, though his party still carried the baggage of its Southern pro-segregation wing. As we reach the late 19th century, the party system starts to look more familiar. The Republicans and Democrats are the two main players, just like today. The Republicans are the party of industry, big business, and northern interests, while the Democrats are a coalition of Southern whites, urban workers, and farmers. Smaller parties, like the Know-Nothings in the 1850s, who were anti-immigrant, or the Free Soilers, who fed into the Republicans, popped up along the way but couldn't break the two-party dominance. The timeline we're looking at ends here, but the story doesn't. These two parties keep evolving through the 20th century, tackling new issues like civil rights, the economy, and America's role in the world. It's a messy history, full of splits and reinventions, but it shows how the fight over ideas has always shaped this country.